What if I told you that you're not lost? What if the crushing weight of confusion, the endless scrolling through self-help articles, the desperate search for purpose, what if all of it is just an elaborate lie you tell yourself? What if the truth is far more terrifying? You've simply refused to wake up. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who dared to map the darkest territories of the human mind, believed that most human suffering doesn't stem from being directionless. It comes from something far more sinister, our active resistance to becoming conscious. We're not wandering in the wilderness. We're hiding in a cave, terrified of the light outside. Think about it. Right now, as you watch this, there's a part of you that already knows what needs to be done. You know which relationships are toxic, which beliefs are holding you back, and which systems are manipulating you. But knowing and acting are separated by an ocean of fear. The fear of responsibility, the fear of isolation, the fear of discovering that everything you've been told about reality might be wrong. Jung called this the most terrifying human task, becoming conscious. Not the gentle awakening promised by spiritual gurus, but a violent confrontation with truth. It's the kind of awakening that shatters comfortable illusions and forces you to see the world, and yourself, as you really are. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. While you've been hiding from consciousness, powerful forces have been working overtime to keep you asleep. They've built entire systems designed to exploit your fear of waking up. They profit from your confusion, your distraction, your willingness to remain unconscious. So the question isn't whether you're lost. The question is, are you ready to stop pretending? There's a strange comfort in being lost, isn't there? When you don't know where you're going, you can't be held responsible for not getting there. When life feels confusing and directionless, every failure becomes evidence of your victimhood, rather than your choices. Being lost is the perfect excuse for inaction. Jung understood this psychological defense mechanism better than almost anyone. He observed that the human mind constructs elaborate fortresses to protect itself from the burden of clarity. We build walls of distraction, endless entertainment, busy work, meaningless relationships. We construct towers of conformity, hiding in the crowd where individual responsibility dissolves into collective anonymity. We dig moats of excuses, explanations for why we can't possibly be expected to take control of our lives. Consider how masterfully our ancestors perfected this art. The Roman Empire didn't just conquer through military might. It conquered through the genius of bread and circuses. Keep the masses fed and entertained, and they'll gladly surrender their freedom for comfort. They'll choose the illusion of security over the terrifying responsibility of self-determination. Modern society has perfected this formula beyond the Romans' wildest dreams. We have bread and circuses on demand, delivered directly to our devices. Netflix algorithms that know exactly what will keep us scrolling. Social media feeds calibrated to trigger just enough outrage to keep us engaged, but never enough clarity to inspire real action. Dating apps that provide the dopamine hit of connection without the vulnerability of true intimacy. The comfort of being lost has become an industry. Self-help gurus who promise transformation without pain. Politicians who offer simple solutions to complex problems. Corporations that sell identity through consumption. Everyone profits when you remain pleasantly confused, perpetually seeking but never finding. But Jung saw through this comfortable prison. He recognized that the feeling of being lost is often a carefully constructed defense against the terrifying prospect of being found. Because being found means being responsible. It means acknowledging that you have power, which also means acknowledging that you've been choosing powerlessness. The most insidious part. This psychological prison feels like freedom. Choice paralysis masquerades as having options. Endless possibilities become an excuse for choosing nothing. The overwhelm of modern life provides perfect cover for avoiding the simple, brutal truth. You know exactly what you need to do. You're just afraid to do it. Carl Jung spent his life mapping the territories that most people are too terrified to explore. While Freud focused on the mechanics of repression, Jung went deeper, into the existential horror of what we're really repressing, consciousness itself. Not just awareness of our personal darkness, but awareness of reality in all its raw, unfiltered brutality. Jung believed that consciousness is not a destination but a process, one that most people abandon the moment it becomes uncomfortable. He wrote, The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But he wasn't talking about some gentle self-acceptance workshop. He was talking about confronting the shadow. That part of yourself that you've spent your entire life trying to deny, repress, or project onto others. The shadow isn't just your personal darkness. It's everything about reality that threatens your comfortable worldview. It's the recognition that your country might be built on violence, that your heroes might be frauds, that your beliefs might be borrowed from people who never questioned them either, that your entire identity might be a carefully constructed lie designed to protect you from the truth. This is why most people flee from inner awareness, like refugees fleeing a war zone. Jung observed that when faced with the possibility of genuine consciousness, people will choose almost anything else. Addiction, depression, rage, fanaticism, anything that allows them to avoid the terrifying recognition that they are responsible for their own existence. Think of consciousness as entering a wild forest at night with no map, no compass, no guarantee of survival. The unconscious mind is like a city, artificial but predictable. You know where the restaurants are, where to find entertainment and where to hide when things get uncomfortable. But consciousness? Consciousness is the wilderness beyond the city walls, where anything might be waiting in the shadows. Jung warned that this fear runs so deep that people will literally project their own darkness onto the world rather than own it. We see enemies everywhere except in the mirror. We diagnose everyone else's problems while remaining blind to our own. We become experts at recognizing manipulation in others while remaining unconscious of how we manipulate ourselves. The irony is crushing. In our desperate attempt to avoid the pain of consciousness, we create infinitely more suffering. We build elaborate psychological defense systems that require constant maintenance. We exhaust ourselves running from the truth that would actually liberate us if we dared to face it. But Jung's warning cuts even deeper. He suggested that this fear of consciousness isn't just a personal problem, it's a species-wide emergency. When entire populations choose unconsciousness over awareness, they become vulnerable to manipulation on a scale that threatens civilization itself. If individuals naturally fear consciousness, then those who understand psychology hold terrifying power. They can exploit that fear, weaponize it, turn entire populations into sleepwalkers, marching toward their own destruction. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's documented history, repeated so often it should be considered a law of human behavior. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, understood Jung's insights better than most psychologists. He didn't just lie to people. He studied their psychological need to remain unconscious, and then fed that need with precision. He discovered that people don't want truth. They want their existing beliefs confirmed, their fears validated, their need for simple answers satisfied. Goebbels wrote, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." But he was working with an even deeper psychological principle. People want to believe lies that allow them to remain unconscious. Truth requires them to think, to question, to take responsibility. Lies let them sleep. The genius of effective propaganda isn't that it deceives people, it's that it permits people to deceive themselves. It provides a socially acceptable framework for remaining unconscious. During the Cold War, both sides perfected this art. Americans were told they were fighting for freedom while their government overthrew democratically elected leaders worldwide. Soviets were told they were building utopia while their leaders built gulags. But today's propaganda makes Goebbels look like an amateur. We live in an era of algorithmic manipulation that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Every click, every scroll, every pause is analyzed and used to construct a personalized prison of unconsciousness. Your social media feed isn't showing you reality. It's showing you a carefully curated version of reality designed to keep you engaged, outraged, and ultimately paralyzed. The most sophisticated propaganda doesn't tell you what to think. It tells you what to think about. It floods you with so much information that you become overwhelmed and retreat into simplistic thinking. It presents false choices that make you feel like you're participating in democracy while the real decisions are made elsewhere. It creates artificial controversies that distract from genuine issues. Consider how masterfully this works. While people argue about manufactured cultural conflicts, Wealth inequality reaches levels not seen since the Gilded Age. While citizens debate which politician will save them, corporate interests write the legislation that both parties will ultimately support. While everyone fights about pronouns and bathroom policies, the surveillance apparatus grows more sophisticated every day. The manufactured sleep isn't just about controlling what you believe. It's about preventing you from believing in your own power to see through the manipulation. It convinces you that you're too stupid, too busy, too overwhelmed to understand what's really happening. It turns complexity into an excuse for unconsciousness. Jung would have recognized this immediately. When people are afraid of their own consciousness, they become desperate for someone else to do their thinking for them. They become willing collaborators in their own manipulation. Just as individuals have shadows, repressed aspects of themselves they refuse to acknowledge, entire societies have collective shadows. These are the truths about civilization that we collectively agree to ignore, the darkness we project onto convenient scapegoats to avoid confronting our own complicity in systemic violence. Jung observed that societies, like individuals, will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid acknowledging their shadow. They create elaborate mythologies about their own goodness, while externalizing all evil onto outsiders, enemies, or marginalized groups. This isn't just psychological convenience, it's psychological necessity for a society that refuses to become conscious. Look at any historical atrocity and you'll find the same pattern. Ordinary people, convinced that they are the heroes of the story, that their violence is justified, that their victims deserved what happened to them. The witch hunts of medieval Europe weren't carried out by monsters, they were carried out by people who believed they were protecting their communities from evil. The Salem witch trials reveal this psychological mechanism in perfect clarity. A community facing internal conflicts and anxieties found it easier to believe in supernatural threats than to examine their own darkness. Women who challenged social norms, who possessed knowledge or independence, became perfect vessels for the community's projected shadow. Killing them felt like righteousness rather than murder. This same psychological dynamic drives political purges, ethnic cleansing, and cultural cancellation campaigns. The mechanism remains identical. Identify a group that can symbolize everything wrong with society. Convince yourself that eliminating them will solve your problems. Then unleash violence while maintaining the illusion of moral superiority. Modern societies have simply made this process more sophisticated. Instead of witch hunts, we have enemy nations that embody pure evil. Instead of scapegoating individuals, we scapegoat entire ideologies or demographics. The shadow gets projected onto terrorists, immigrants, political opponents, anyone who can serve as a screen for our own repressed darkness. But Jung's insight cuts deeper than individual scapegoating. He recognized that our collective denial of truth creates a psychological fragility that makes entire civilizations vulnerable to collapse. When societies refuse to acknowledge their shadows, those shadows don't disappear. They grow more powerful in the darkness. Consider the psychological fragility of contemporary culture. A society so terrified of its own history that it can't have honest conversations about race war or economic inequality. A culture so committed to maintaining comfortable illusions that it treats uncomfortable truths as violence. A civilization so afraid of its shadow that it's tearing itself apart trying to maintain the pretense of innocence. The polarization we see everywhere isn't just political disagreement, it's the collective shadow, erupting into consciousness in distorted, destructive ways. When societies refuse to consciously examine their darkness, that darkness eventually demands attention through crisis, conflict, and chaos. Jung warned that this collective unconsciousness creates a feedback loop. The more a society refuses to wake up, the more dramatic the events required to force awakening become. Let's destroy a comfortable lie. Awakening is not a gentle process of gradual enlightenment. It's not meditation retreats and inspirational quotes. Real awakening, the kind Jung wrote about, is a violent psychological death followed by an uncertain rebirth. It's the complete annihilation of everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. Jung called this process individuation, but he might as well have called it psychological warfare. Because that's what it is. A war between the false self you've constructed and the authentic self that's been buried underneath years of conditioning, conformity, and cowardice. Most people lose this war by refusing to fight it. The violence of awakening isn't metaphorical, it's viscerally real. When you begin to see through the lies you've been telling yourself, when you recognize how thoroughly you've been manipulated, when you understand the depth of your own self-deception, something inside you dies. The comfortable identity you've spent decades building crumbles like a house made of cards. Socrates understood this when he chose death over abandoning his commitment to truth. His prosecutors offered him exile, offered him the chance to stop asking uncomfortable questions, to stop forcing people to examine their beliefs. He chose hemlock instead, because for someone who has truly awakened, returning to sleep isn't an option. It's a form of death worse than physical death. Friedrich Nietzsche experienced this psychological violence firsthand. His insights into the nature of morality, truth, and human consciousness literally drove him to the edge of sanity. He wrote, "If you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." This wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was a warning based on lived experience. Consciousness has a cost, and not everyone survives paying it. Modern whistleblowers embody this same tragic heroism. Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange. People who woke up to uncomfortable truths about power and chose to speak rather than remain complicit. They lost everything: careers, relationships, freedom, sometimes their lives. But they gained something that most people never experience: the terrible freedom that comes from refusing to live a lie. The psychological death of awakening involves losing not just your illusions, but your social connections to people who remain asleep. When you stop participating in collective delusions, you become an outsider to your own community. When you refuse to pretend that everything is fine, people who need that pretense will see you as a threat. This is why so few dare to fully wake up. The isolation is crushing. The responsibility is overwhelming. The knowledge of how much suffering could be prevented if more people chose consciousness becomes a constant burden. You become like Cassandra, cursed to see the truth but never to be believed. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. This psychological death isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. Because only when the false self dies can the authentic self be born. Only when you stop defending illusions can you begin building something real. The violence of awakening creates space for something unprecedented. A life based on truth rather than convenience, authenticity rather than approval, consciousness rather than comfort. We live in an era that would have fascinated and horrified Carl Jung in equal measure. Never before in human history has the collective unconscious been so systematically manipulated, so precisely engineered, so completely outsourced to digital systems designed to keep us perpetually asleep. Your smartphone isn't just a communication device, it's a consciousness suppression machine. Every notification is calibrated to interrupt genuine thought. Every algorithm is designed to feed you more of what you already believe, creating digital echo chambers that make awakening nearly impossible. Every app is engineered to trigger dopamine responses that keep you scrolling rather than thinking. Consider the psychological genius of social media. It provides the illusion of connection, while ensuring genuine intimacy remains impossible. It offers the appearance of information while delivering carefully curated propaganda. It creates the feeling of agency while making you increasingly passive. You think you're choosing what to watch, read, and believe, but sophisticated algorithms are making those choices for you based on psychological profiles more detailed than anything the Stasi could have imagined. The manufactured reality we inhabit makes previous forms of propaganda look primitive. Soviet citizens knew their media was controlled by the state. American citizens during the Cold War understood that the news had bias. But today's propaganda is invisible, personalized, and psychologically sophisticated beyond anything Orwell imagined. Your digital feed isn't just showing you information, it's constructing your reality in real time. The stories you see, the people you're exposed to, even the advertisements you encounter, are all carefully selected to reinforce existing beliefs and prevent genuine questioning. You live in a bubble so perfectly calibrated that you can't even see its walls. Jung wrote about the unconscious as a forest, dark, wild, unpredictable. But we've outsourced our unconscious to corporate servers, running algorithms designed to maximize engagement and profit. Instead of confronting our psychological shadows in the wild forest of genuine introspection, we're fed digital shadows specifically designed to keep us distracted, divided, and dependent. The result is a kind of consciousness that Jung never encountered: artificial consciousness, manufactured awareness, digital dreams that feel more real than reality itself. People develop passionate opinions about events that never happened, form deep emotional connections to people they've never met, and base their entire worldview on information that's been algorithmically selected to manipulate their behavior. This creates a new form of psychological prison, one that feels like freedom because you have infinite choices, but every choice has been predetermined by systems you don't understand, created by people whose interests conflict with your own. You can scroll forever, but you'll never accidentally encounter information that challenges the fundamental assumptions keeping you asleep. The tragedy is that the tools that could facilitate unprecedented human awakening, global communication, access to information, the ability to connect across traditional boundaries, have been weaponized to prevent awakening. The same technology that could liberate consciousness has been perverted into the most sophisticated consciousness suppression system ever created. In Jung's terms, we're living in a collective dream so elaborate, so immersive, so psychologically satisfying that most people never even realize they're sleeping. Even with all this knowledge, even understanding the mechanisms of manipulation and the importance of consciousness, why do so few people actually wake up? Because the cost is exile, both internal and external. Jung understood that awakening often isolates the individual from the collective dream, and most people would rather suffer in community than heal in solitude. The social cost of awakening is immediate and brutal. When you stop participating in collective delusions, you become incompatible with people who need those delusions to function. When you refuse to pretend that obvious lies are truth, you make others uncomfortable about their own willingness to pretend. When you stop consuming the same media, believing the same narratives, sharing the same outrage, you become a stranger to your own community. Relationships that seemed solid crumble under the weight of consciousness. Friends who bonded over shared complaints suddenly have nothing to talk about when you stop complaining. Family members who connected through mutual victimhood feel abandoned when you take responsibility for your life. Romantic partners who were attracted to your vulnerability feel threatened when you become genuinely strong. The internal cost is even more devastating. Awakening means acknowledging that you've been complicit in your own manipulation. It means recognizing that every excuse you've made, every victim story you've told, every external force you've blamed, was a way of avoiding the terrifying responsibility of consciousness. The shame of this recognition can be crushing. You discover that your entire identity has been constructed from borrowed ideas, inherited beliefs, and unconscious reactions to childhood programming. Everything you thought made you unique, your opinions, your preferences, your personality, turns out to be a collection of conditioned responses. The person you thought you were doesn't actually exist. But Jung recognized that this dissolution of false identity creates space for something unprecedented: authentic individuality. Not the fake individuality sold by consumer culture, expressing your uniqueness through product choices, but genuine psychological independence. The terrifying freedom of creating yourself consciously, rather than being created by unconscious forces. The people who dare to pay this cost discover something that remains invisible to those who choose comfortable unconsciousness: real strength. Not the brittle strength of a defended ego, but the flexible strength of someone who has survived psychological death and been reborn. Not the fake confidence of ignorance, but the quiet certainty of someone who has faced truth and lived to tell about it. They develop immunity to manipulation because they've learned to recognize their own capacity for self-deception. They become incapable of being controlled through fear because they've already survived their worst fears. They stop needing external validation because they've found something more valuable: internal authenticity. But perhaps most importantly, they discover that exile from collective unconsciousness isn't really exile at all. It's graduation. Because once you wake up, you realize that the community of sleepers was never really a community. It was just a collection of people avoiding consciousness together. The real community exists among those who have paid the cost of awakening. It's smaller, harder to find but infinitely more real than anything available to those who remain asleep. Carl Jung lived through 2 world wars, witnessed the rise of fascism, and observed how quickly civilized societies could descend into barbarism. His final warnings weren't academic theories. They were desperate attempts to prevent humanity from repeating patterns of unconsciousness that lead inevitably to catastrophe. Jung believed that unconscious societies are doomed to repeat their darkness until external forces make awakening unavoidable. He observed that when collective shadows remain unexamined, they don't simply disappear. They accumulate power in the darkness until they explode into consciousness through war, economic collapse, or societal breakdown. Consider the psychological dynamics that preceded every major historical catastrophe. Populations that refused to examine uncomfortable truths about their societies, leaders who exploited collective unconsciousness for personal gain, and systematic suppression of voices that attempted to warn about coming disasters. The pattern is so consistent it's almost mathematical. Germany in the 1930s wasn't uniquely evil, it was uniquely unconscious. A population traumatized by war and economic collapse became desperate for simple explanations and strong leaders. Rather than examining the complex historical forces that created their suffering, they chose to believe in scapegoats and saviors. The result was predictable to anyone who understood the psychology of collective unconsciousness. The Soviet Union collapsed not because of external pressure, but because a system built on lies eventually exhausted itself trying to maintain those lies. When reality becomes too different from the official narrative, cognitive dissonance reaches breaking points that destabilize entire civilizations. Jung's warning for contemporary society is chilling. We are exhibiting all the psychological preconditions for civilizational collapse. A population addicted to comfort and distraction, leaders who exploit division and fear for personal gain, systematic suppression of uncomfortable truths about economics, environment, and social sustainability, collective denial of problems that require collective action to solve. The environmental crisis isn't just about carbon emissions, it's about consciousness. A species that refuses to acknowledge the long-term consequences of short-term thinking will continue destructive behaviors until external reality forces change. But by then, the change may be too catastrophic to survive. The economic system isn't just about inequality, it's about the psychological need to believe in infinite growth on a finite planet. A population that refuses to examine the fundamental assumptions of consumer capitalism will continue supporting systems that concentrate wealth and power until those systems collapse under their own contradictions. The political polarization isn't just about policy disagreements. It's about the terror of facing complex truths that don't fit comfortable ideological categories. A society that chooses tribal certainty over nuanced reality will continue fragmenting until shared governance becomes impossible. Jung's most terrifying insight: if we refuse to wake up voluntarily, chaos will wake us up involuntarily. The unconscious forces we refuse to examine don't disappear. They accumulate until they manifest as external crises that make awakening unavoidable. The question isn't whether awakening will happen. The question is whether it will happen through conscious choice or unconscious catastrophe. So here we are, back where we started, but now you understand the weight of that opening statement. You're not lost. You've never been lost. The crushing confusion, the endless searching, the desperate need for someone else to tell you what to do, all of it is elaborate theater designed to avoid a simple, terrifying truth. You know exactly where the path leads. You're just afraid to walk it. Carl Jung spent his life mapping the territories of consciousness that most people are too frightened to explore. He discovered that the greatest human suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from our refusal to become conscious of our own power, our own responsibility, our own capacity for both creation and destruction. The systems that surround you, the digital distractions, the manufactured conflicts, the comfortable lies, they all exist because consciousness is rare and unconsciousness is profitable. Every institution that benefits from your confusion has a vested interest in keeping you asleep. Every voice that promises easy answers is selling you a drug designed to prevent awakening. But awakening isn't a destination, it's a process. It's not a comfortable spiritual journey. It's a psychological war. It requires the death of everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. It demands exile from the community of sleepers and acceptance of the lonely responsibility of consciousness. The cost is everything you think you are. The reward is everything you could actually become. Jung's final gift was this recognition. The violence of awakening creates space for authentic existence. When you stop defending illusions, you can start building something real. When you stop hiding from truth, you can start wielding it as a tool for transformation rather than suffering it as a source of fear. The world desperately needs people willing to pay this cost. Every crisis we face, environmental, economic, political, social, stems from collective unconsciousness. These aren't problems that can be solved by sleeping people using unconscious methods. They require awakened individuals willing to see clearly and act consciously, regardless of social approval or personal comfort. But here's what Jung understood that most spiritual teachers miss. You can't wake up for anyone else. You can't save the world by remaining unconscious yourself. You can't lead anyone to freedom while you're still hiding in your own psychological prison. The path forward is simple, even if it isn't easy. Stop pretending you don't know what needs to be done. Stop waiting for perfect circumstances or complete information. Stop hiding behind the comfortable lie that you're just lost and confused. You're not lost. You're not confused. You're not a victim of circumstances beyond your control. You're afraid to wake up, and until you're more afraid of staying asleep than you are of consciousness itself, nothing will change. You'll keep searching for the answer you already know. Keep waiting for permission you don't need. Keep postponing the confrontation with the truth that could actually set you free. So the question that remains, the only question that has ever mattered, is this: will you keep dreaming? Or will you finally wake up?